Christmas as fighting continues in their homeland.
All those people in Ukraine, they don't have safety like I have here in Canada.
Also tonight, 15th time's the charm.
You know, my father always told me, it's not how you start, it's how you finish.
The U.S. House of Representatives finally elects a new speaker after days of chaos. And as COVID cases surge in China, desperate citizens beg for treatment.
The hospital tells us, no, we don't have any beds for you. And if you send your grandparents to hospital, it's only getting worse.
That's later, but first. Around 140,000 Ukrainian nationals came to Canada in 2022, many fleeing the war with Russia that's now dragging into its 11th month. Those circumstances make today's Orthodox Christmas a bittersweet celebration. Philip Lishanok found out how Ukrainians in Canada are marking the day.
25-year-old Yulia Koladru came to Canada in May, alone. But at the All Saints of Ukraine Chapel in Oakville, Ontario, she feels anything but.
Here in Canada, I wasn't alone on these holidays because I was with my friends and new family.
Today is Christmas for those who belong to the Eastern Orthodox Church and follow the Julian calendar. But as she celebrates, her thoughts are with those back in Ukraine.
All those people in Ukraine, they don't have safety like I have here in Canada.
Anna Chaokina came to Canada with her son Victor, who's 6 months ago. She's from Kyiv and was an architect in Ukraine.
We had a normal life like you. We was a normal people, but 1 second everything is broke.
Now they're refugees. Her husband is still in Ukraine fighting.
Men cannot leave Ukraine. They must protect our country, and it's the most difficult what we have now in our life, that all Ukrainians families are separated.
John Holuk is with the church and is involved in the nonprofit organization Hearts for Ukraine, which helped many of the families who arrived here seeking shelter. He says he worries for those left behind and feels strong bonds with his homeland.
Waking up every morning, not knowing if there was a country, not knowing if that would be there the next day.
And on this holy day, promises of mercy have not been kept. Our town used to be so beautiful, says a 75-year-old resident of a town in the Donbas region. She stands in the debris at the center of town as artillery is fired, saying Russia's declared 36-hour ceasefire is in name only. I think they're tricking us. If someone makes a promise, that someone must fulfill it. Russian President Vladimir Putin had announced a ceasefire would be observed today so Orthodox Christians could celebrate Christmas. But attacks on the eastern Donbas region of Ukraine appeared to continue. And for those still living in fear, this is perhaps not a day for celebrations. Philip Lishanok, CBC News, Toronto.
Business can finally get underway in the U.S. House of Representatives. After 15 ballots, Kevin McCarthy has taken the gavel as House Speaker, ending days of gridlock in Washington. But as Chris Reyes tells us, McCarthy's struggle to win signals a bumpy road ahead for the Republican-controlled House.
Finally, after midnight.
Therefore, the Honorable Kevin McCarthy of the state of California, having received a majority of the votes cast, is duly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives.
That call brought McCarthy supporters to their feet after a grueling and dramatic week that saw one defeat after another, vote after vote, 14 in total.
That was easy, huh?
A strong finish that even had McCarthy signing autographs.
You know, my father always told me, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And now we need to finish strong for the American people.
The tipping point came late Friday on the 15th ballot when McCarthy's fiercest detractors voted present, lowering the number of votes McCarthy needed to secure the win. He also had to win over 14 of the 20 who voted against him, One of McCarthy's loudest critics, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida.
And I would like to know what the basis is to allow somebody to occupy the Speaker's office who comes in second place 10 straight times.
The biggest criticism from the Republican holdouts, that McCarthy isn't conservative enough on issues like border security and government spending to lead them against President Joe Biden's agenda. McCarthy credited President Donald Trump for helping him get the votes.
I don't think anybody should doubt his influence. He was with me from the beginning. He really was. I was just talking to him tonight, helping get those final votes.
Mary Scott Greenwood is with the Canadian American Business Council. She says the concessions McCarthy had to make, including making it easier to oust the Speaker, mean his victory came at a steep price.
The power of the Speaker has definitely been watered down, and so the Pelosi era with such discipline and seriousness is clearly gone. I think it's going to be very difficult to run the House of Representatives and to make policy.
With the Republicans holding a majority in Congress, to vote for Speaker should have been a formality. It's the first time in 100 years it took multiple ballots to elect a Speaker. McGill University historian Jason Opel says the dramatic vote reveals fractures within the party.
A small minority of Republicans, approximately 21 Republicans, are basically a group of people who refuse to have governance happen at all. They want to dismantle, minimally, they want to dismantle vast amounts of the federal state and of American society.
Even with McCarthy's victory, there's no avoiding his detractors. He may have won the gavel, but governing will be a whole other challenge. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
Iran says it has executed 2 men for their involvement in anti-government protests. They were hanged after confessing to killing a member of an Iranian paramilitary force. Rights groups say those confessions were extracted under torture. Hadi Gaimi is the executive director of the U.S.-based Center for Human Rights in Iran.
The only evidence really is the confessions obtained under torture. So these were not a judicial process and execution following the judicial due process for sure. These are purposeful murders of innocent people.
4 people have been executed since protests swept across Iran after the death of Mahsa Amini last September. Thousands more have been detained by Iranian authorities. In China, hundreds of millions of people are on the move. Today's when people start traveling for Lunar New Year, an annual mass migration event, especially since this is the first holiday without Chinese travel restrictions since 2020. But the rush is happening as COVID cases and deaths are on the rise. While officials in China downplay the severity of the virus, Canadians with family there say their relatives are in a desperate situation. Lisa Xing reports.
Patients receiving oxygen at a hospital in Zhejiang province in eastern China. Like so many people in the country right now, the wait to see a doctor is hours long. That's if you even make it there.
The hospital tells us, no, we don't have any beds for you. And if you send your grandparents to hospital, it's only get worse. The situation here in the hospital is like hell. That's why my parents have to take care of them in their home.
Shu is a Canadian whose entire family lives in China. They all contracted COVID in late December. Even as her grandfather's condition worsened, the hospital would not accept him. He died on New Year's Day.
Just powerless because you really care about them and you want help.
Because it happened so quickly and because of long quarantines, Shu was unable to go back to China. So was Daniel Zheng, whose cousins, uncles, aunts, parents, and grandparents all contracted COVID too. Luckily, they've all since recovered.
I was worried. It would be very helpful if I'm able to go back to stay with my family. At least I will be able to look after them.
Hospitals and funeral homes say they're overwhelmed. Beijing's U-turn on its years-long zero-COVID strategy means China's 1.4 billion people have little immunity as measures are relaxed and cases surge. We're short-handed, says this doctor, though many of my colleagues are sticking to posts. If someone gets infected, others will fill the vacancy. Health experts predict at least 1 million deaths in China this year, although officials have reported 5 or fewer a day since the policy change. In a briefing this week, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the COVID situation in China is under control and will continue to closely monitor possible mutations of the virus and release relevant information in a timely manner. The World Health Organization has questioned that commitment, calling for more transparency, as several countries, including Canada, imposed COVID testing requirements on visitors from China. And starting Sunday, Canadians with Chinese passports can return to China without a mandatory quarantine. A negative test is enough. Too late, though, for many like Shu who have already lost loved ones.
I cannot do nothing. I can just wait and talk to my mom. I also comfort them because she lost her father.
Lisa Xing, CBC News, Toronto.
Venezuela's National Assembly voted this week to dissolve its interim government, ending the leadership of Juan Guaido and replacing the legislature with a committee that will oversee presidential elections next year. Guaido has been a key opponent of President Nicolas Maduro and has led the U.S.-backed interim government since 2019. Freelance reporter Jacob Kessler reports.
Muchísimas gracias, secretario.
Shortly after being ousted as leader of Venezuela's interim government, Juan Guaido warned the move would create a power vacuum and would encourage more Western nations to recognize the Maduro administration. Indeed, it seems Western governments who have backed Guaido over the past 4 years are now second-guessing their support for the embattled politician. The United States said it will continue to support the interim government regardless of what form it takes. But on January 3rd, the U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price declined to say whether the U.S. government was dropping its recognition of Guaido.
We continue to recognize what is the only remaining democratically elected institution in Venezuela today, and that's the 2015 National Assembly. We and the region's democracies will continue to support the efforts of the 2015 National Assembly and others to return democracy to Venezuela.
Despite Price's ambiguity, Axios reports, senior State Department officials have confirmed that since the interim government no longer exists, the U.S. no longer recognizes Guaido as its president. Canada has been similarly opaque in its response to developments in Caracas. In a statement released yesterday, Global Affairs Canada said it respects the decision not to restructure the interim government. The statement, though, made no mention of the recently ousted Guaido. Meanwhile, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has called the U.S. response to recent events in Venezuela unfortunate. In an interview, Maduro said, Venezuela is completely prepared to take a step towards the normalization and regularization of diplomatic, consular, and political relations with the United States and subsequent governments. In recent years, the Biden administration has been much softer in its approach to Maduro compared to its predecessor. However, it is unlikely that Joe Biden will recognize Maduro as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. This changing attitude on Juan Guaido is in line with the mood of many Venezuelans. According to a recent survey, a paltry 6% of Venezuelans said they would support Guaido in next year's presidential primaries. Jacob Kessler for CBC News, Lima.
At least 29 people are dead and 21 arrested in Mexico's Sinaloa state after a wave of street fights between members of a drug cartel and security forces. The violence broke out after police arrested Ovidio Guzman, the son of drug kingpin Joaquin Guzman, also known as El Chapo. The U.S. is looking for Guzman to be extradited on drug trafficking charges, but a Mexico City judge halted the extradition yesterday following the outbreak of violence. Meanwhile, Ottawa continues to urge Canadians in the region to shelter in place. Carmen Galvez is from Calgary and is in Sinaloa with her family. She says it's not clear when they'll be able to return home.
Nobody knows who the cartel could be. And if you're in the wrong place and the wrong time, that's the danger. They try to keep tourists apart, and Mazatlan is a safe paradise, but this is beyond anybody's imagination.
The violence in Mexico will not alter the Prime Minister's plans to travel there. Justin Trudeau is scheduled to attend the North American Leaders Summit in Mexico City next week, along with U.S. President Joe Biden and Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Well, it's a new year, and we're battling a new strain of COVID. XBB.1.5 is an Omicron subvariant that is spreading throughout the U.S., making up nearly 28% of cases nationally this week, but more than 70% in the U.S. Northeast. The World Health Organization has called it the most transmissible strain yet. Infectious diseases specialist Dr. Isaac Bogosh joins us now with more. Dr. Bogosh, what is it about this strain that makes it so contagious?
Yeah, there's a couple of mutations that it has that really seem to enable this to evade some of the protective immunity we may have gathered along the way, plus also bind to the receptors in our body a little more snugly, for lack of a better word. So it does seem to be more contagious, and it does seem to have a growth advantage in the United States. What's interesting, though, is that yesterday the CDC actually scaled back the growth advantage with updated data. So yes, it still has a growth advantage, just not as big as what was once thought a few days ago.
But the Public Health Agency of Canada says there are already at least 21 cases here. So how worried do we need to be about this?
I think we just need to watch this and be cognizant that we have cases of this here, just like there's other sublineages of Omicron here as well. And we can the same steps still stand. We know how to protect ourselves and how to protect those around us. Like, we know we can be updated with the vaccine boosters, especially people over the age of 60 who are most at risk for more severe manifestations of the illness. We know we can put a mask on in a crowded indoor setting to reduce the risk of transmission. Like, the same rules apply. There actually is nothing new.
Is there anything that we're seeing about this strain that would make it more serious or more deadly?
No, in fact, nothing like that has been seen. I still think it's premature, and we should always discuss some uncertainty about that. But so far, none of the signals out of, for example, New York or other areas we've seen demonstrate any more significant clinical manifestations. It looks like it's, sadly, more of the same. But again, whenever there's a potential growth advantage, we can expect a rise in cases in the community, and those usually translate to a bump in cases, sadly, in the hospitals, and of course a rise in deaths. So it's also winter, and we know that there's been innumerable gatherings over the holiday season. Variant or not, we'll probably see a rise in cases associated with that, as we've seen this time last year, as we've seen this time 2 years ago as well.
Well, and of course, it's also still just regular cold and flu season. How are we doing on that front?
Interestingly, the influenza season in Canada started earlier than anticipated. It came out of the gates like a rocket, but the most recent updates in Canada demonstrate that influenza is in decline. I should still comment that there's still a lot of flu out there. It's a long way down the other side of the mountain, but we are on the way down the other side of the mountain. So that's a good sign. And then many people were learning about another virus, respiratory syncytial virus. They might have heard about that this year. It was a particularly nasty year for children. But of course, this can impact older adults as well. And the rates of RSV in Canada are about what we would normally expect them to be this time for a regular year.
All right, being on the other side of the mountain sounds great, but there is still a way to go before spring. So any tips to make it through the rest of the season without getting sick?
Yeah. I think it's extremely important for people to get an influenza vaccine. And, I think there's some unexpected curves in some of these viruses that are not behaving in their regular seasonal pattern. The flu season started earlier. Is it going to end earlier? Maybe, but we don't know. I think it's a wonderful idea if people haven't got their flu shot to get it. Of course, COVID-19 vaccines, especially for people over the age of 60. And then, of course, stay home if you're sick. It doesn't matter if it's flu, RSV, COVID, or something else. There's no point getting anyone else sick. And then lastly, masks, I think, are really, really helpful in indoor settings. You can reduce the risk of transmission. You reduce the risk of getting an infection. So very reasonable to do during periods of high viral transmission.
Dr. Bogosh, always great to chat. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Infectious diseases specialist Dr. Isaac Bogosh in Toronto. Well, whether it's streaming services like Netflix or Spotify, or that gym membership that may or may not get used, Canadians are used to seeing monthly fees on credit card statements. But it's not always easy to keep track of what we're paying for each month, and it can be even trickier to stop those charges. The CBC's Anis Haydari has more on what consumers should watch out for.
I got to this Spotify subscription and I said to her, okay, do you still use this? And she's like, I don't have Spotify.
Vanessa Bowen was helping a client go through her finances when they were both surprised by a recurring charge.
I was like, it's out of your credit card. Like, they're charging you.
The personal finance expert sees this happen a lot. In this case, her client had paid her ex-boyfriend's music bill for months without realizing it.
I feel a lot of people don't look at where their money's going. They're not really sure where they're spending their money.
Recurring subscription fees make regular appearances on credit card bills for Canadians these days. You can subscribe to groceries, alcohol, candy, and of course, entertainment. Think Netflix. And yes, Spotify. A survey last October found more than 4 in 5 Canadians subscribe to streaming services. That matches the experience of money mavens like Vanessa Bowen.
A lot of people are spending more on subscriptions than they even realize. And of course, that hurts our pocket at the end of the day.
It's not a new business model, right? It's a model that's been around for hundreds of years, dating back to books and magazines and periodicals.
Adam Levinter is a subscription expert and author of The Subscription Boom. He says the advantage for subscription companies is they don't have to keep reselling themselves to customers. So customers have a responsibility to pay attention.
The company assumes the customer is otherwise satisfied with the product or service and will continue to bill that customer in perpetuity unless the customer decides to cancel. So that's a big fundamental shift.
But Levinter says it's not all on the consumer. Companies have a big role to play.
You have a responsibility to make it easy for your customers to reach you if they have questions or concerns. And you have a responsibility to allow the customer to cancel, pause, hold, defer, really control their subscription.
The trouble, of course, is when you run into trouble. Canadians can try filing a dispute with banks for transactions they don't recognize. But keep in mind there are more consumer protections for credit cards versus debit cards. Ken Whitehead is with the Consumers Council of Canada.
As complex as it could be to try to get a credit card charge reversed, it will be easier than with a debit card.
In Canada, the Competition Bureau has cracked down on fraudulent subscription offers, but experts say overall the onus is on the consumer to keep track of their bills. And always remember to cancel your ex-boyfriend's Spotify if you're paying for it. Anis Haidari, CBC News, Calgary.
And with that run, Valerie Grenier becomes the first Canadian winner of a Women's World Cup giant slalom race since 1974. It's the first ever World Cup medal for Grenier. The 26-year-old from St. Isidore, Ontario, has won medals in junior events, but she broke the tibia and fibula bones in her lower right leg in 2019. Grenier's win comes 2 races after a disqualification in Austria for leaving the start gate too early. She describes today's victory in Slovenia as a dream come true. You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio 1. You can listen to this program anytime by downloading the CBC Listen app and searching for The World This Weekend. You can also find us on the CBC News YouTube channel. Extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, and storms have forced millions of people around the world to become climate refugees. Among them, people who live and work in the wetlands in India's eastern state of Odisha. But that's starting to change. The local community and NGOs have found ways to make environmental protection a lifeline for young people looking for work, and increasing numbers of them are deciding to stay put. Freelance reporter Murali Krishnan explains.
Migratory birds mill about on Chilika Lake in Odisha. The brackish water lagoon is the largest in the eastern state. It is also a biodiversity hotspot with tens of thousands of birds flocking there each year. Around 10,000 people live in nearby Mangla Jodi, mostly engaged in work around the wetlands. More than half the population depends on fishing for their livelihood and have an almost family-like bond with the ecosystem. But over the years, the changing environment has impacted the economic opportunities of the locals, especially fishing. Youth in the town have turned the corner by taking ownership of the wetlands. Sugyan Bera is now a tour guide. He says the body of water was his family's lifeline, but extreme weather limited their employment options.
It was extremely difficult to find a job, and we were forced to migrate to provide for our families. We could not fish, and it was difficult, especially after cyclones.
The shrinking of the Chilika Lake due to climate change, heavy siltation, dumping of waste, and overgrowth of bamboo grass had led many young people to leave. But a slew of initiatives in recent years have led to interventions focused on water body protection, rejuvenation, and livelihood generation. UNICEF's Youth for Water has engaged young people in activities that strengthen ecosystem resilience, cleaning up tourist spots around the wetlands and training them to learn about visual cues to diagnose problems in the water. Srinivas Bera, who trained to become a tour guide, says there are signs of hope.
Earlier, there was a lot of migration, but it has come down drastically. Now people are involved in tourism and activities relating to the water body. Livelihoods have improved, and this is encouraging.
There's also been an increase in capture fishery, reduction in weed infestations, and the number of migratory birds visiting the wetlands has grown.
Earlier they were migrating very huge. Now it is gradually declining because of the conservation of wetland, because of attracting tourism.
Stalin Naik, director of the Pantis group of non-profits, has been playing a role in training up the youth.
They are getting into new livelihood aspects, aquaculture, and second one is creating different artifacts, which are the eco-products.
Though there is no official data on the number of people who have left Mangla Jodi for other states, many locals say fewer people are leaving since the youth-led initiatives provided more employment opportunities. Anvesa Datta is a coordinator for the UNICEF-supported Youth for Water.
I feel that youths from other districts will get motivated by these youths who have actually done something, and even they will start initiating small efforts within their hometown, and then they will take it up to the community level, and then they will become youth champions.
Even before climate change became a push factor, economic stagnation meant many people were forced to leave Odisha. But experiments like the ones carried around Chilika Lake had given cause to residents to stay and give back to their communities. Murli Krishnan for CBC News, Odisha, India.
Welcome to the whitest sweater that you've ever heard of. Where everyone is nicer, but it's never nice above.
Welcome to the farthest place you'll get from Disneyland.
Fish and chips and shipwrecks.
This is no fun land.
Welcome to the run.
An islander, I am an islander.
You're probably very familiar with that song at this point. Welcome to the Rock from the hit Canadian musical Come From Away. This version is the London, UK cast performing at the Olivier Awards back in 2019. Today, after 1,048 London performances, the show closes in the West End.
Welcome to the land where we lost our loved ones and we said, we will still go on.
Welcome to the land where the wind strikes the blow.
And we said no.
Come From Away tells the true story of 7,000 air passengers stranded during 9/11 and welcomed into Gander, Newfoundland. It's a beautiful show that tugs at the heartstrings, from its earliest performances in 2013 to just yesterday, when actor Alice Fern met the real person behind her Come From Away character, pilot Beverly Bass.
All the way to England. I can't continue, Beverly.
For today's closing performance, Timbits were handed out to people waiting in line, and co-creator David Hine was there for the final goodbyes.
This is a show about community, and on stage and off, this is one of the most beautiful communities that we've known, and it's expanded from the people, our friends, who we first met in Newfoundland, who are beautiful friends here.
It's not the last of Come From Away for British audiences. A tour across the UK and Ireland starts next year. For now, we'll leave you with a little more from the West End cast. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. Thank you for being with us. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.